All right, we'll go ahead and kick off. Hey everyone, welcome and thanks for joining us today. I'm Jack Ulrich, CMO at Cart.com. We've been doing these tariff webinars now with Tim Manning for a little while, but given the news last Friday, it was a good reason to get the gang back together. I'm joined today by two people who need no introduction, Omer Tariq, our CEO here at Cart.com, and Tim Manning, one of the sharpest minds that we know in the global trade policy. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we kick off. We'll be recording today's session and we'll send the replay to everyone registered. If you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll have time at the end to get through as many as we can. So please try and get them in early and we'll try and get those things organized. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Omer, Tim, welcome back. Tim, let's kick off here and just if you can give us a few minute introduction to basically what happened at the Supreme Court level and how we should be thinking about this at a million-mile view.
Great. Well, Jack, good to see you again. Amir, good to see you, and good to be back with everybody talking about tariffs again. So, what happened recently in the last couple of days is the Supreme Court finally dropped their ruling on learning resources v. Trump, the kind of pending case on IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. I think nobody needs the kind of the refresher on where we've been on this, but President Trump, last year, kind of shortly after taking office, used the IEEPA statute to issue kind of global tariffs, rapidly changing different rates, different countries, for a variety of different reasons, and kind of using an unprecedented use of IEEPA to issue these tariffs. A number of cases were working their way through various courts, and the case that got to the Supreme Court within the last couple of months was this learning resources case. There were a number of questions about whether the president actually had the authority to use IEEPA for tariffs. I think, if you go back to our first conversations about this, I think the general conclusion was it's written very broadly and it's going to be a legal test of whether he could. It did not explicitly include tariff authority, but it said regulate commerce. And so that was what was at question here. The various justices that came down on either side of this, it was a 6-3 ruling. A number of different justifications, the Chief Justice and a number of conservative justice that ruled against the president came down on the major rule doctrine, that basically there's no explicit delegation of power from Congress for tariffs here. The balance of the justices that sided against the president basically said, we don't even really need to go there. It's clear on the language. There's no authority there. So where we are today, the court ruled against the president on the use of IEEPA. Those IEEPA tariffs then were struck down. The president issued an executive order rescinding all of those tariffs. At the same time, he issued a proclamation invoking Section 122 of a different trade law that established more tariffs, another 10% global base tariff. We'll talk about that in a minute, and reinstated the de minimis. The other question about the Supreme Court issue is that he used IEEPA to basically eliminate the de minimis exemption under 321, that anything imports under $800, that was eliminated. That was not mentioned explicitly in the Supreme Court case. Many people say that by invalidating his use of IEEPA for trade, that invalidated that section as well, but it wasn't explicit, and the president reinstituted the rescission of the 321 de minimis rule. So there is still no de minimis exemption. That's kind of where we sit today.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really good roundup. Omer, I know you've been talking with merchants and customers all week. Is this a win or a loss for retailers?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think for the first 5 minutes, it was a win because the immediate reaction was that I will get an instant refund for what I paid and everything's going to be fine again. And, I say fine again because, just to kind of recap 2025, the volatility imposed on the retailers, especially the smaller guys, who are unable to have the negotiating power with the manufacturers abroad to force the tariff costs onto them were pretty great. And then the volatility associated with which country do we move the sourcing to, because it was a little bit of a moving target going from one country where it was 15% one day to another country where it was zero, but then went to 25% overnight. It provided a level of uncertainty to a lot of these retailers, in addition to rising costs of doing business. That honestly has been one of the bigger challenges these retailers have faced in over a decade. Seeing the ruling was a little bit of a relief for a lot of them, because I think the initial reaction was, "Hey, this is going to get reversed. It's going to be hard to get it replaced by something else." And as a result of this, we're number one going to get refunds for potential tariffs and duties that we've paid. But then two, there is a good possibility here that we can have a level of predictability in our sourcing and supply chain in the future, versus having to play a game of moving targets. So I think what would quickly happen after about 10 minutes of excitement is, I think it got quickly replaced with the uncertainty of how am I going to even get my refund back, because as even the Supreme Court stated, that it's going to be a very messy process. In addition to a potential legal battle that's going to ensue for, maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 years to actually get those refunds back. But then, as in the process of trying to, figure out these refunds, what other tariffs are going to be implemented? And as we saw, the administration quickly rebounded, as Tim mentioned, invoking a section under the Trade Act that they were able to put on 10% tariffs right away, could be raised to 15%. So, in all honesty, I think a lot of retailers are probably at this moment in time sort of neutral to what has happened. They are hoping that they are able to get their hands on the refunds that are going to be issued as part of this ruling. But how much of those will be actually seen in what period of time, and how much other tariffs are going to be implemented by the administration and potentially after the 150 days by Congress, is something that I think everybody is going to be watching out for.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, there's been a long sort of legal road that set us up for this direction and where this has ultimately gotten us to. So, Tim, maybe we just quickly, before chatting through like the Section 122 stuff, maybe talk about some of the legal road, like who challenged this, how did it move so fast, how did we get here? Let's get a little bit of background on that, and then we can go into 122.
Sure. So going back to the very first executive orders back in, I think it was early February of last year, that first invoked the IEEPA. You recall at first it was just on Canada and Mexico and China around fentanyl. And then later there were what he was calling the the global, basically, reciprocity tariffs,
Yeah,
or
Liberation Day.
yeah, Liberation Day. Almost immediately there were legal questions. Well, not almost immediately there were legal questions. We all kind of anticipated that he might actually use IEEPA in this way, even, through the transition into when he was coming into office. And when he did, there were lawsuits almost immediately that this authority lacked, IEEPA lacked the authority for the president to do these kind of, um, you know, punitive tariffs. He's changing tariff rates on different countries, as Omir said. On a Tuesday, it'd be zero. On a Thursday, because of something that happened in the news cycle or some foreign policy thing, it would be 30%, 25%, 50%. It just changed all over the place. So it was working through a number of different court cases, a number of different appellants working their way up. This final case is the one that made it to the Supreme Court. Um, there are a couple of issues that in the ruling that remain kind of unmentioned. So Justice Kavanaugh is the only one who mentioned the reimbursement piece of it in his dissension, and that it's in the dissent, and not part of the actual case law, that it's left unsettled. And so now we will be basically into a series of it's up to kind of a next series of lawsuits for whether, to get the money back from the government. There was no direction to set up a refund process by the court. So and Secretary Bessent just in the last, I think 70 or 48 hours has said it's now going to work its way through the lower courts, and they will abide by the ruling. I think the question everybody should be kind of paying attention to is which case through which courts. We have seen a number of times different rulings in different places, and the secretary did say that they will abide by the rulings, but I don't know that. I think we need to watch that. We've heard that from the administration before, and they've changed course before as well. So I think that's, kind of where we are on the IEEPA and the refund piece. I think the other question is if there are any other cases that are working their way through, whether the Supreme Court would hear one on the de minimis exemption. So use that same IEEPA authority to eliminate the Section 321 de minimis um, exemptions. That is potentially still outstanding as well, because that wasn't part of the final ruling. And
Well,
we all deal with that. Sorry, Jack, go ahead.
and I think I was just gonna add to that, Tim. It's even like the actual refund process is not straightforward in the sense that um, it's the importer of record, the IOR, which is the party that's listed on the U.S. Customs entry documents, that can directly file the refund with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So if you as a retailer filed, customs entry paperwork, you likely qualify in a much more easier fashion versus if like a distributor, freight forwarder, or a supplier handling imports, you may not be able to automatically qualify right now, right? So there's another layer there's an operational or mechanical layer that's more complicated about getting your refunds as part of this process, in addition to the legal battle that may ensue in the lower courts.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a question out kind of hanging out there too, that there's some discussion around that if you pass those fees on to a subsequent customer, whether you're eligible to get that refund, or, especially if it's been explicitly passed on. Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty at this point.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to untangle here. I mean, I guess transitioning, IEEPA now is effectively gone, and we're talking about Section 122 as kind of the new foray into this whole tariff argument. Tim, what exactly is, just for our audience, Section 122, and is it legal? And are we set up for? Is this a sustaining plan, or are we kind of set up for another IEEPA situation?
Well, that's the big question. And it's a really good question. Obviously it's not settled yet. It hasn't worked its way through the courts, but we can kind of talk about a couple of things off the top. So Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, it basically it allows for a temporary import surcharge of up to 15% for a maximum of 150 days. That's it, for a balance of payments issues. So it's not about trade deficits, it's about a balance of payments. So your question, is it legal? The consensus, if, as much as one it seems to be forming, is probably not. It's that for the purposes for a kind of global floor of a tariff in lieu of what the arguments that the president was using for IEEPA, that's not what's happening here. The balance of payments issue, and most analysis of that, there really is no balance of payment issue. That this is, that's not just about trade, it's about the entire flow of all payments of, back and forth, and it is essentially zero. So there really isn't one in the first place, and it's not what the president's trying to achieve is not a balance of payments issue anyway. The kind of widely held kind of view at this point is that it's not a legal use of the Section 122 for what he's doing here. Now, the challenge is going to be, of course, I'm sure there are probably suits being filed today. It went into effect yesterday. Wednesday, yeah, Tuesday, went into effect yesterday. It's at 10%. The president threatened in the 15, which is the cap. He has not done that yet. The proclamation as it sits is 10. It's stackable on top of the other most favored nation rates. couple of weird artifacts of that is, for example, China now has roughly a little bit higher, but roughly balanced aggregate tariff as Vietnam, Cambodia, India, even in some other places. So now you're seeing if they're, if your cog prices are lower, China, like there's parity there now. If you stack them on top with Europe, you're actually kind of raising Europe from where they were. It's a bit of a mess right now. There's a number of countries that are still trying to decide whether the trade agreements they had been negotiating are going to hold through this new regime. None of that is really settled yet. One thing to note, though, in the proclamation, the President did carve out all of the existing carve-outs that were held during the IEEPA tariff structures. So USMCA exempt, anything under 232 or 30, Section 301 or Section 201 exempt. So if you had an exemption before under the IEEPA structure, you'll have an exemption now under this 122 structure. So I think, yeah, those are a lot of different kind of, I think, things that are uncertain. I think that really what it comes down to is that 122 is designed for large and serious balance of trade, balance of payments issues. We do not have a large and serious balance of trade issue globally with all trading partners. So that kind of all will remain to be seen. And one last thing on the legality piece. The administration justice lawyers explicitly said that 122 and the balance of payments issue is not an applicable alternate strategy to the IEEPA tariffs when they were arguing that the IEEPA tariffs should stay in place. So the administration's already argued that this isn't an appropriate use of that section that they're now using. So we'll see where that goes. It's a 150-day cap on how long they're in place. Whether a court case could get to could work its way through to a ruling that would hold before July 22nd, I think is the expiration date,
Yeah.
is probably pretty unlikely.
Yeah, so we're probably in for a fairly tumultuous 150 days here. Omer, I'm curious, when you're having these conversations with customers, merchants, et cetera, how does that 15% globally compare to what merchants were actually paying under IEEPA?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think just to build up on Tim's point here, right? I think what's really challenging right now is that there were these countries that came to the table. Japan's a great example that struck deals with the administration and said, "Hey, we will invest this many billions of dollars in U.S. infrastructure. We will, as part of this, reciprocate lower tariffs for your products. Let's sign these more permanent agreements that were now putting these countries in a favorable sort of cost of importing, bucket, if you may. But with this sort of broad strokes 10% global tariff application, what's unclear is if it's stackable on top of those, are there going to be carve outs on these on a by country basis? I don't even know if mechanically that's possible and if it's easy to implement, where you say, hey, anything coming from Japan is exempt from the 10% blanket tariff. So I think there is likely going to be an overlap here where some countries that were considered as more favorable cost of import because of deals that they struck with the administration, to Tim's point, are now either on parity or maybe even a little bit more expensive. Because if you think about it, the countries that were impacted by the IEEPA tariffs were the ones that did not struck, a favorable deal with the administration. So they, by definition, ended up having higher tariffs. Well, if the higher tariffs relative to the favorable ones have now gone away, what's going to happen, mathematically speaking, is that these countries are actually now going to have, even with the 10% or 15%, slightly better import costs than the ones that actually came to the table and did deals with the administration. So I think, again, for retailers, this is a turbulent, tumultuous game that they have to play to understand the actual cost of what's going to be imported. And to Tim's point, all this could be temporary. If there's a court case that it's likely going to be, because the legality of this is pretty shaky in terms of whether it's the administration's allowed to use this to implement some of these tariffs. It's going to be very interesting to watch and see how this unfolds in the next 90 to 120 days. And I think retailers are just going to have to power through it, unfortunately. I mean, there's not a lot of comfort that people would have based on anything that's happening right now.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I mean, yeah, it is certainly a time of discomfort. Omer, do you have any suggestions for what e-commerce operators should be doing in terms of their cost structure and how they should be analyzing this situation and sort of preparing and battening down the hatches for it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the things that a lot of these retailers and e-commerce and omni-channel consumer products companies and so on and so forth did over the last sort of year and a half is number one, for the period of time where they had certainty on, hey, there is no tariff that's going to be implemented, they really quickly expanded their inventory levels in those periods of time so that when there is a sort of complicated war going on around which tariffs are going to be implemented or not, they were able to sort of protect themselves from it, at least for a period of time. I know that some of these retailers are continuing to figure out bonded warehousing strategies. So number one, if they're able to find a way to import higher levels of inventory before a lot of this mayhem actually makes its way mechanically into the customs and duties, rack up your inventory. Number two, look into bonded warehousing solutions where the immediate cash impact is not there, because you can essentially sort of have a delayed payment schedule for some of these duties. If you're using a bonded warehouse process, this is going to become a attractive value proposition for them. Again, if in the next 6 months this goes away, then the working capital impact of this could be very positive for the retailers. And then the third one is do not change your pricing to reflect this right away. And what I mean by that is, there was an immediate sort of question of, hey, if these tariffs have been now reversed, is the U.S. consumer going to see lower prices because the retailers are going to be like, well, I don't have to pay 20% tariff on this. I don't have to charge 20% more to my consumer. And I know everybody is sort of itching to get pricing down because it has a positive impact on conversion. But I would just say stay the course, business as usual, around the pricing strategies and watch how this actually unfolds. Because for all we know, the country you now moved to because they were a favored nation may end up costing you more to import from, right? So I would say over the next 30 days, retailers have to be very agile and adaptive, but at the same time, not be making big wholesale pricing changes, um, buying inventory in ways that allow them to get ahead of some of this, and then looking at bonded warehouse solutions would be, I would say, my suggestion. I don't know, Tim, if you would want to add anything to that.
No, I think you're right on. The recommendations, right? There's as far as the go forward, I think there's too much uncertainty to really make dramatic changes at this point. Uh, I mean, look, IEEPA being rescinded, IEEPA being struck down by the court and then rescinded by the president, that is the kind of status quo floor. Now we're sitting with the 122 on top. Who knows where we're going to land on that? There could be an injunction pretty soon. Whether the administration agrees with a lower court injunction or appeals and works that, I suspect they would continue to escalate like they did with IEPA, in which case we won't get resolution until it's expired anyway. There will be pressure on the Congress to do some lawmaking that grants explicit authority to the president that he assumed under IEPA, that the court has said you did not get that explicitly from the Congress. That may change things into the future. Um, so yeah, I think we probably don't know enough to make long-term strategic decisions at this point.
Yeah.
And I think the rest of your recommendations are right on. Yeah.
I will say, just to add a couple of more things that come to mind, I think number one, especially for the smaller retailers, I think you need to really figure out if you're the importer of record. That because that's an important designation that allows you to actually go after the refunds or not. So you gotta figure that out. The second thing is you've got to really start mapping out harmonized tariff schedule classifications, right? So try to see like, okay, based on at a per product, per SKU level, per your import schedule, based on the HTS, which is the harmonized tariff schedule, if these 10% or 15% tariffs are implemented on top of whatever your current sort of schedule is, how does this map out to your cost of goods sold? I would do that right now, right away, because I think what you don't want to do is, because a lot of retailers don't have 35% EBITDA margin, right? They're operating at 5 to 10% EBITDA margins. And if all of a sudden your cost of goods sold are going to start going up by 10% and you've not adjusted pricing accordingly to it, then you're going to be caught in a place where your working capital is going to see a pretty quick squeeze, right? So having the data and doing the analysis and understanding how to model out the impact of these 10 to 15% tariffs, how to model out, refunds potentially delayed, what's happening in the middle of the process. Your finance teams need to really step up their analyses function as you sort of figure out what you're going to get into based on kind of where you're importing your products to is sort of something that I think is very, very critical. And then I think, look, there is going to be there's going to be a window of time that is going to be, and I don't know, Tim, if this has been already announced or not, but there's going to be a window of time during which you have to file the protest for refunds. And if you don't meet those windows and you're sort of caught outside of it, you can still get your refunds, but then the process may take years longer for you to get the refunds back, right? So be closely monitoring, very closely monitoring what those windows are that these refunds can be filed. See if you're an actual importer of record. And if you're not, if you're working through a freight forwarder distributor, start working with them in terms of what this means for you. Analyzing very, very quickly what the math is telling you in terms of how the harmonized tariff schedule is going to be impacting your own cost of goods sold, modeling out your working capital needs. Buying up inventory in ways you can, and look, I would say cautiously start thinking about once again diversifying sourcing strategy, right? Because think about this: if these are deemed, if IEEPA is deemed illegal, which it has been, or unlawful, the new tariff may or may not be there. What is going to happen after this? Where should you be moving your sourcing? And if your competitors get ahead of you, and let's say that China is we're unable to implement any tariffs on China, let's say that, but you've moved your sourcing out of it, but then your competitors are able to go back there and they no longer have the tariffs. Well, they now have a 10 to 20% cost benefit relative to your business model, right? So as much as it's painful for you to go back to China, you may have to do that, right? So I would start getting highly active in trying to figure out how the sourcing strategy may need to be diversified yet again based on
Yeah.
the administration's ruling.
Yeah, if I might toss a couple of things on there too. 100% agree. And I would go so far as even if you're not the importer of record, start preserving all of your records. Just come look at it as preservation, and monitor where CBP is. There has been no official process delineated yet by CBP and Treasury and Commerce on how that will happen. The Secretary of Treasury has said we're going to watch for the courts and the court rulings, and really we don't know what's going to come out of that. It's going to depend on which case goes where. So preserve all those records, make sure you've got a full accounting of all of regardless of where are in that chain, and be prepared for what comes out of the courts. And then as far as we mentioned there's a couple of exemptions, in the for at least for the next 150 days under this proclamation using 122, he's carved out the other, and we need to come back to Section 301 tariffs and 232 because that's going to be the next path that they're going to be looking at. But I mentioned that USMCA is still exempt. He also did carve out an exemption for the Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement. So that's Costa Rica. Let's make sure I got everybody right. Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica are all duty free as well under that free trade agreement. So there are some that have been explicitly carved out under the proclamation of the existing structure while we wait for what happens under 301, 201, or 232. And it looks like we may have lost Jack. So now it's just
It's just
us. We
you and
can
me,
we can
Tim.
bounce back and forth between us. Yeah.
Tim, I will ask you, it is something that it feels very unprecedented in terms of the amount of volatility this is imposing.
Yeah.
Um, at the economic level, mid, small, large retailers and ultimately consumers being impacted by this. What are your thoughts in terms of like, do you see that the midterm elections coming up in November, are they gonna maybe ultimately make things a little bit better? Based on your tremendous amount of experience in the government for as long as you've stayed there, do you think things are gonna get a little bit more stabilized, or do you think this level of volatility is gonna continue? Jack, I stole a moment to ask Tim a question while we were missing you.
Yeah, no
That's a
worries.
great question.
Having connectivity issues, I guess. Thank you.
It's a great question, Amir. So I kind of look at it kind of before and after the midterms. There's going to be pressure, as I mentioned, for Congress to try to do something to get explicit the delegation of authority back to the president in an amendment of one of these trade agreements or trade acts or something like that. Now, the a big part of the court's ruling was that there was this non-delegable authority question that the tariff authority is in Article 1 of the Constitution. There's nothing in Article 2, and that Congress can't delegate its inherent constitutional authority to the executive. That's the major questions doctrine piece of it. And so there'll be pressure to do that. I mean, there's been delegated authority under all these other trade acts. And so if they try to get that done in time, if they get that done and passed before the midterms, before across the summer, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard for them to get that done. They're going to go into recess in August as always, and it's going to go right into the teeth of the election cycle. So they really got to get it done through the spring and early summer, and I think it's going to be a hard job to get done. But I'm sure there'll be pressure too. If we get into the midterm cycle and the either or both of the House or the Senate flip, I would expect there's going to be a dramatic kind of slowing of the volatility coming out of the executive. Because for a few reasons. I mean, the Congress, a Democratic Congress, or even if it's a split, will slow down a lot of the actions coming out of the off the Hill. I would anticipate there's probably going to be a whole lot of investigations launched. There's going to be a lot of oversight hearings that aren't currently happening. There's going to be a lot of that activity, and there could even, if both houses switch, they could be even kind of pushing a rollback of some of this delegated authority, even though the president's likely to veto that. That will happen as well. So I would really expect to see, I mean, on far end, even impeachment hearings on the probably more realistic end, or maybe not, somewhere in the middle, it would be a lot of oversight and a lot of activity that slows the kind of what we can see now as kind of the administration's perception of almost unfettered power with the backing of the Congress that leads to a lot of this volatility. So I I think it's very likely uh, with either, especially if both, we'll see a slowing. But in the run up to that, if it looks like it's going to happen, it may even increase
The
trying to get
volatility.
some stuff
Yeah,
done
that's
before it gets, yeah,
that's what I
before
was
the House votes.
thinking. I mean,
Yeah,
the next, which is really interesting, right? Because you're talking about getting into the peak season in Q4, and that's the feast or famine for a lot of the retailers. And
right.
having this level of uncertainty spiking right before that could be very problematic if
Yeah,
people don't have their act together. So it's going to be an interesting year, that's for sure.
yeah,
Sorry, Jack. Back to you with your questions.
No problem. Yeah, I think we covered a lot around the refund and everything else. So I just want to transition quickly and just a reminder to the audience, please submit questions via the Q&A. We'll get to those in the next like 5 or 10 minutes or so. But just talking a bit more about the future, Tim, I mean, there's a lot of chatter about Section 301. Why is this really kind of the administration's long-term answer? Is it still viable if the House or the Senate switches come midterms? What does sort of the playing field look like at that point?
yeah. Well, so there's a number of different there's a number of different tariff structures in a couple of different laws that we talk about a lot. Section 301 is one of them. There's also 201, 232, and even 338 is being talked about a little bit. Nobody hasn't been used in 100 years in this way. Probably wouldn't work either, but that's kind of where we are, is trying things that haven't happened before. So let's go talk about 301. That's probably the one you're going to hear most about. Section 301 is a section of the law that deals with unfair trade practices. Section 201 is for where there are fair trade practices, but disadvantage domestic industry, and it's a short-term thing. Section 301 is for unfair trade practices, and Section 232 is a national security tariff. So what's happening, most of what you hear about right now outside of IEEPA are 232 and 301. 232 tariffs, when you hear investigations and tariffs about high capacity batteries, semiconductors, rare earth minerals, that's Section 232. There's one about medical devices, and an investigation happening now. There's one about pharmaceuticals pending that may drop any minute. All of these things require an investigation, and that's why the president is pushed towards IEEPA. IEEPA, people argued, he agreed that that gave him the ability to just do whatever he wanted to do when he wanted to do it. These other sections require investigation and findings, and so that can be a little more challenging. And that's what they did. That's what the Trump administration did in the first Trump administration back in 2017. That were 301 and 232. That frustrated a lot of the administration because those investigations take a long time, and there has to be evidence to back the finding. And so that's kind of where we are now. They've said that they're largely going to look at Section 301, which is unfair trade practices, and use that and there's no cap on that. The Biden administration used Section 301 to put a whole range of 100% tariffs on a bunch of critical manufacturing products, medical devices, some semiconductor stuff, personal protective equipment, a number of different things. So there's no limit to kind of the number on there if the research and the finding by the U.S. Trade Representative supports it. The question I think we want to watch for, is if they revise that investigatory period. Like if they find an expedited way to do it that is maybe not as slow and not as methodical or empiric as has historically been done, then they can be more reactive with 301 and be closer to where the president wants to be on, kind of quick actions. But again, it's about unfair trade practices, and where we saw the president doing a lot of things were using IEEPA were around security issues or foreign policy issues, not necessarily about trade, and that would be hard to tie into the 301 investigations. So I think you're going to be seeing a number of different things. If I can, while I'm talking about it, the last one you may hear about is Section 338. That is about basically where there's a unfair trade practice against the United States, where they're supporting one of our kind of an enemy of sorts. It's never been used in 100 years for anything like this. It's unlikely. It would be basically using an authority. It would be right back to the IEEPA issue, and all those same kind of counter arguments of that's not what it was for. It was never used like this. You're going to assume authority that's not granted to you, just like you did in IEEPA. But I think it's a possibility and will likely be part of the conversation.
Yeah, it's a highly dynamic chessboard at this point, that every retailer and every merchant is going to have to be navigating. Just before we turn to the Q&A, I want to ask, I guess, one final question of both of you. What's the single biggest piece of advice for merchants that you can provide heading into really the rest of 2026?
I'll jump first, and then first, preservation of record and work with your counsel on on the reimbursement process. That there is $2 billion worth, somewhere between 170. There's a big number, depending on who you listen to. Roughly $2 billion they've been collected, and is going to be arguably due for refunds. And so get your records together, work with counsel, and get ready to chase that down as it works through the courts, or as CBP and Treasury issue some guidance on what that process will be subsequent to a court ruling. One. Two, look at, as you hear all this kind of grabbing at authorities that we might be hearing about, like the Section 122 stuff. Anytime there's these proclamations, there are written in, so, USMCA and the Central America Free Trade Act are exempted there. Those things are there. So for the next 6 months, 5 months, as we work through whether there's legality in 122, there are paths, duty-free paths that are written as carve-outs in the proclamation that can be looked at in the short term. If those kind of switching costs and that timeline works in the short term, that might be advantageous.
Yeah, I mean, look, I just to kind of build up on what Tim is saying, and I want to like maybe underscore one point, and then there are some sub points underneath that. But in my opinion, because I've been a retailer, right? I've been on the other side where I ran a retailer. I was at Home Depot, part of the leadership team, and I think the number one thing right now is you have to preserve flexibility. And what does that mean? It's a broad term. Like, what does preserving flexibility means is avoid any decisions that are one-way door decisions. So, don't change prices in a permanent fashion up or down just yet. Don't overshift your supply chains in panic. um, Keep your contracts somewhat adjustable so that you have the ability to make economic changes to it. You've got to maintain inventory discipline, no speculative overstocking. Very data-driven stocking is sort of like what I've been recommending. The product that's going to move, the product that has the least amount of price elasticity, great overstock in that. But anything else, you have to be very careful of speculative overstocking based on the movement of these tariffs. And then file your protective refund claims, right? If you're the import of record. This is something that needs to be done fairly quickly. But those are my sort of five sub points over a broad point, which is preserve and maintain your flexibility. That's going to allow you to survive and thrive in this environment versus making knee-jerk, panicked reactions and decisions, especially ones that are one-way doors that cannot be reversed.
Yeah, thank you both. Let's turn it over to the Q&A. I'm going to go through just a few questions here, and I'll try and assign them to each of you, but feel free to chime in when and where you want. So the first one we have here is probably, Tim, I think this is around section 122. Wouldn't the big deficits with other countries be, quote, balance of trade issues? Can you unpack that one a little bit? I think it's a balance
Sure.
of payment issues is the
Well,
terminology you
that's
have.
the confusion. Yeah, that's the root of the confusion. The Section 122 is about a balance of payments issue, and it comes from like the devaluation and some stuff in the 70s with coming off the gold standard and foreign exchange and that sort of thing. But it's not about trade imbalances. It's about a balance of payments, and most of the as it gets unpacked, essentially most economists will argue that our balance of payments issue is actually zero. That there is, for every dollar going out, a good or dollar comes back in exchange, and what it was originally written for, those conditions don't exist. And it's not about trade exactly. It's about the balance of payments across the entire economy, both monetary and trade and goods. And so this kind of idea that there is a trade deficit in one country that leads to a global application of a surcharge when the law is actually written about large and serious balance of payments issues. You know, most arguments we don't have a balance of payment issue at all, much less a large and serious one, much less one with every country in the world for that kind of global application of a 10% floor tariff. So that's the legal argument that the lawyers are making right now, and I think we'll see kind of work its way through. I mean, we're 24 hours into the application of this, and the consensus seems to be laying down there.
Yeah, thanks. I'll put this to both of you guys, but there's a question here from Malad. Would we know what percent of the tariffs applied to 2025 entries is eligible for refunds? Basically, like a documentation question, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's going to be this is why preservation of records, working with council and working with everybody is going to be really important. Any of the IEEPA in tariffs that's what's been invalidated. So if there's an existing tariff under 232 or 301 or 201, or any other trade act or any other trading agreement or any those will not be. but anything that was layered on by IEEPA. So if you can go back into 2025 through the whole series of executive orders where all these were invoked by executive order. So they're all in the Federal Register. You can go and pull back which one at which point. You know, some places you had them layered on, like in China in particular, they changed a couple of times, you know, over the period of a week or 10 days, and they moved up and down. There were the fentanyl national security tariffs, and then there was the Liberation Day tariffs, and there were lots of things stacked on top of each other. But if they came out of executive order using authority under IEEPA, they've been zeroed out and theoretically subject to refund for
Yeah, I mean,
100%
I
of this.
think Yeah, I think, just to kind of layer out specifically question from to answer the question from Milad, I think the first thing you got to figure out is like which legal authority the tariff was imposed under. You got to figure out the exact entry dates, whether the entry is still legally contestable, and then whether the company was an importer of record or not, right? So, and just to kind of really break it down for you, when you think about the refund eligibility, you've got duties, that are bucketized in three or four buckets, right? One is the Section 301, the China tariffs, which are not, I'm not sure how much they're impacted by this. There are the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs that are not impacted. There are the normal MFN duties that are not impacted. But then there's the IEEPA-based tariffs that are the ones that are struck down and potentially refundable. You now have to go sort of in and understand the entries made while the invalidated IEEPA tariffs were in effect, before they were replaced by the Section 122 within the protest deadlines. Usually, it's about 180 days from liquidation, right? So you've got to like do a lot of calculation on it. But the short answer is yes, but you have to follow a very specific process around it.
Yeah, Kelsey asked a question here in a similar sort of vein, but for countries that have finalized trade agreements recently, like Bangladesh, for example, are they now bound through the agreement to the reciprocal rate, even though it's been rescinded? Or is it void and they will be subject to the 10% for 150 days?
Yeah, unless there is a explicit exemption, even countries with free trade agreements are going to be paying the 10% global tariffs. I mean, Tim, I don't know if you want to add to that, but unless there's a specific country or FTA, hey, you have a free trade agreement, or you have an agreement that's exempted, you're gonna have to pay those tariffs on top of whatever whatever's there.
Yeah, the 10% sitting on top of the MFN tariff number, if where they apply, and 201 and 301, everything else. If yeah, and I'm not unfortunately familiar with the lines of every one that was negotiated under IEPA over the last year, but if, for example, a country negotiated with the administration, settled on numbers, and those numbers were implemented via IEPA, which is the case for a lot of them, those have been invalidated. So those countries can't be held subject to that because the authority to, legal authority on the U.S. side to use them has been struck down by the court. But like I said at the beginning, there are a number of countries who are still trying to decide whether they're going to stay within the terms of what they had negotiated, and get the administration, using those terms, have the administration amend the existing proclamation that pulls them out of that 10% global floor. And that's what's all still up in the air. The only things, all we have currently working somewhere on my desk here is a copy of the proclamation, is the list of specific items, not by code, not by HTS code, but yeah, by name. Anything, and then anything subject to 232, 301, or the US China or the Central America. If there no other trade agreements are mentioned in the proclamation, no other authorities are mentioned in the proclamation, so all of that is kind of irrelevant to the existing this 10% structure that got dropped down by 120, like 122.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, we're sort of kind of restarting the cycle here,
Yeah.
with and starting again from scratch with just some tea leaves to read for the future. Another question here from the Q&A. Omer, I'll turn to you on this one. Has overall volume dropped through all retailers because of tariffs, or is volume change very sector specific?
Um, Look, I think, and I'm assuming you're referring to 2025.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, we saw periods of times where volume actually went up because if you think about it, a lot of these retailers onboarded a lot more inventory to avoid some of these tariffs. And I think the consumers were aware that this could be inflationary on their pocket. So they actually increased, we saw this sort of dynamic in Q1, Q2 of 25. Parts of Q3, we saw dollar volume going up, but unit volume being down or flat because of the way pricing was adjusted. I mean, I think a very large number of retailers chose to pass down those prices to their end consumers, and as a result, conversion was impacted, and as a result, unit volume declined. Q4 started to stabilize again. So it's a 2025 is a tale of different quarters, depending on kind of how much inventory each category had left over from the non-tariff space and how much pricing that they were able to offer either at discounts or at raised pricing, depending on the category that was impacted, where they were. So it was all over the place, right? So, I mean, net, I think 2025 ended up being an okay year, but I think part of the reason why it ended up being an okay year is because a lot of these retailers were able to get ahead of the very large inventory buys and be able to sort of like use that to grow and pump up sales in 2025. I think 2026 is going to be a little bit of a different story, especially in light of sort of the macro softening a little bit, right? So you can't just raise prices and send it off to the consumer and say you pay for it.
Right. There was coincidentally another question here around inventory levels that I think is good for you, Omer. How should retailers, merchants be thinking about inventory levels between now and the July 24 deadline?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would, man, this is a tough question because there's so much uncertainty, right? Like you're kind of like you're gonna have to ask the eight ball. But like I said, if you stick to things that are two-way doors, which is don't do speculative buys, assuming things will go one way or the other. Don't overstock, but certainly don't understock. I mean, my recommendation is really to stay the course. I think the more important analysis that needs to be done is not so much as how much inventory we necessarily should be buying. It's more about how do we model out the cost of the inventory based on the different scenarios. And then based on those scenarios, what is going to be the outcome for my business if A happens, B happens, C happens, or D happens, and be prepared for all those scenarios, right? So, and I'm sure as part of that scenario analysis, there is going to be certain things that are going to be uncovered that, hey, based on the country that I'm importing this product from or this subset of a product from, there is not there's not a big impact from the tariffs, and I can maybe overstock here a little bit. But hey, here temporarily, I have to maybe slow down the buys, right? So I think it's a very company specific problem that can only be answered at the company level. But your analysis around scenario planning is going to determine your ability to be successful this year. Full stop. Period.
Yeah, and I mean, there's one more question here around scenario planning. Omer, this is probably once again good for you since it's around the finance side of things, but how should we be building financial models when the tariff rate could change three times before year end?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, man, I think it's a lot of if then formulas within Excel, right? And what I would say is that I know this is a painful process and it's an arduous process, especially for the smaller mid-size folks that don't have 30-person finance and data teams, right? But you've got to nail down that, hey, if the number is 10%, how does that flow all the way through to the landed cost of the product? And how you've got to get really smart about your cost accounting and have the flexibility in your models to say, hey, if scenario one plays out, do I run out of cash? Because that is the stark reality of what might happen if you're unable to be adaptive to the environment. So this is not just am I going to make more money or not? Am I going to have a good peak or not? For some, this could be an existential problem, right? So I cannot emphasize enough. You've got to get your financial models to be more scenario based models. You've got to have your cost accounting done with scenario based levers at the landed cost, point, and be able to determine. And look, in the meantime, right, the no regrets move to be doing right now is to optimize your costs. The no regrets moves to be doing right now is to be negotiating contracts with your vendors, and going to scaled providers, like a cart.com, that's out there that can provide you economic benefit, working capital benefit, if you are using our transportation program. So you've got to start thinking about your strategy and saying, hey, how am I going to reduce costs? Because whether tariffs are this or the other, it's only going to be helpful for you, right? It's going to give you a little bit more cushion to absorb what may be coming. So one, get really smart about the scenario analysis based on different sort of things that may happen around the tariffs. But then two, I would optimize your cost of doing business as much as you can right now, because that's a no regrets move.
Thanks. Yeah. Let's wrap with one more question here from the Q&A. I'll turn this to both you guys. We hear the news say tariffs are causing inflation, not causing inflation. You guys being on the field, how have these 2025 tariffs affected inflation wise?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll go first since I've been really close to this. There was absolutely a one-time pricing adjustment that happened in 2025. Now, this is because this is a one-time, this is not a persistent inflationary problem, but um, most consumers felt the pinch in their pocket due to the pricing changes that had to be implemented by these retailers. Again, if you're not a Walmart or Costco, you don't have, one, the ability to negotiate with your manufacturers for them to absorb these costs, and then two, the large balance sheets to be able to absorb those costs yourself. You just don't have that, right? So what do? You pass it on to your customers. So there was absolutely an impact on pricing and inflation due to these tariffs in 2025. Now it was a one-time deal. It's not something that causes persistent inflation year over year, but albeit it's a one-time hit.
Yeah. I would just say there was and continues to be a lot of debate about how much of that's passed through to the consumer. I mean, we just hit it, but I think, most of the economic modeling, the consensus that's lying down around now is somewhere between like 40, depending on the goods, durable goods, like up in the 96%, uh, and generally in the 60, 70, 80%. I mean, it's unquestionably inflationary when you're layering on a tax out on the consumer. And via that, wherever it ends up getting paid, it's being paid on this side of the balance sheet. The, and those kind of, I think we may see some adjustments as some of these rates go down. And we are just talking about this for the last hour. Be careful about changing your prices now, but eventually there's going to be some pricing adjustments. But it's unlikely that we're going to see a uniform reduction down 20, 30%, or more, to kind of 2024, 23 levels, pre IEEPA tariffs. And so I don't think there's likely, you know, well, there's a whole bunch of things. If we push $2 billion or back into the economy, or if there's probably how do you say this? It's multifactorial, right? There's potential $500 billion in defense spending that's going to come down on the U.S. economy in the next year. There's a couple $1 billion of refunds potentially coming in through the IEEPA tariffs. There's a lot of inflationary things that might be happening over the next year that are separate from a pass through of another 10 or 20% of tariff on top of imported goods. And untangling that might be challenging, but I think we are probably looking at a pretty volatile couple of quarters from an inflationary perspective, even if things look like they might have tamped down a bit. I don't know what I'm hearing, but I like if you listen to the Fed governors and folks, they're all talking about how a lot of the numbers aren't necessarily the kind of baseline that we're used to, that's kind of collapsed on itself. And so a lot of the indicators that we're looking at aren't necessarily indicating what we think they might be indicating. And there was so much kind of front loading of inventory, and consumer behavior was off a little bit. So it's kind of hard to know where we really were compared to previous bunch of years and where we're going. But I think it's a watchword to be uncertainty and volatility, at least going in for the next year.
Right. That's going to do it for us today. So yeah, thank you both, Tim, Omer, for your time and helping us cut through the noise. And thanks to everybody that joined live and sent in questions. As a reminder, we'll send the recording out to all registrants. If you didn't get to ask a question today, or if we didn't get time to answer your question, please feel free to email us at tariffs@cart.com, and we'll get to it as soon as possible. And thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.